Picture a clear morning on the Brooklyn side of the East River, somewhere in the long stretch of years before the First World War. A man stands at the foot of the Great Bridge with a roll of papers under his arm. Beside him is another man, newer to the country, his shoes still stiff, his English still careful. The first man waves a hand toward the towers and the cables that climb into the sky, and he says, in effect, "All of this is mine, and I am tired of running it, and for the right price it can be yours." Money changes hands. A document changes hands. And the buyer walks away believing he now owns the most famous bridge in America. A few days later, a policeman finds that same buyer trying to string a rope across the walkway, or hammer together a little wooden booth, getting ready to charge every soul who wants to cross the river he is certain he paid for. The officer has to explain, slowly and not for the first time, that the bridge belongs to the city of New York, that it has never been for sale, that the papers in the man's hand are worth nothing at all. The story goes that this happened often enough, with one bewildered new owner after another, that the police at first did not know what to make of it. It took, by some tellings, the third confused man caught trying to collect tolls on a public bridge before the officers stopped treating each one as a lone lunatic and started to see the pattern. Somewhere behind all these proud, ruined buyers was a single seller, working the same trick over and over, and nobody yet knew his name. He did not own the bridge. That never stopped him from selling it, again and again, for decades. His name was George C. Parker, and the question that hangs over his whole strange life is a simple one. How does a man sell something he does not own to person after person in the biggest city in the country and get away with it for the better part of 30 years? To understand that, you have to understand the bridge and the city and the river of hopeful strangers pouring into both. The Brooklyn Bridge opened on the 24th of May, 1883. It took 14 years to build, and it cost the lives of around 20 men, maybe more, including the engineer who first designed it. John Roebling died of an infection after an accident at the very start of construction. His son Washington took over, ruined his own health in the caissons sunk deep in the riverbed, and finished the work largely from a sickbed, while his wife Emily carried his instructions to the site day after day. When it was done, it was the longest suspension bridge in the world, its 2 stone towers rising higher than almost anything else in the city, its steel cables singing in the wind. People came just to look at it. They wrote poems about it. To a newcomer stepping off a boat, it must have looked less like a bridge and more like proof that anything in America was possible. That feeling is the soil the con grew in, because at the same time the bridge was going up, the city was filling with people who had crossed an ocean to get there. Through the 1880s, they landed at a place called Castle Garden, at the tip of Manhattan, the old immigration depot that handled millions before it closed. After 1892, they came through Ellis Island instead, that famous gateway in the harbor, where the Great Hall echoed with a dozen languages at once. They arrived from Ireland and Italy and Poland and 100 other places, carrying what they could lift and a faith that here, finally, a person could buy his way into a better life. They had heard that in America the streets were paved with gold. They half believed it, and some of them had real money in their pockets, savings scraped together over years, ready to be put into anything that looked like a future. Think for a moment about what those people did not have. They did not have the language, not yet, not well enough to argue contract terms with a fast-talking native. There was no network of friends who knew the city's tricks, no one to pull them aside and say, "That man is a swindler, keep walking." A lawyer on call, a bank officer they trusted, an easy way to walk into a government office and demand to see the real records. None of that was theirs. Many of them came from places where a man of standing, well-dressed and well-spoken, was generally a man you could believe. They carried that assumption across the water with them, and in the streets of lower Manhattan, it became a weakness that men like Parker could feel out in a single conversation. The newcomers' trust was not foolishness. It was the ordinary trust that lets any society function, set down in a place engineered to punish it. A man like George Parker looked at that crowd and did not see strangers. He saw customers. Here we have to be honest about what we know and what we only think we know, because the story of George Parker is wrapped in a fog of legend, and a careful telling has to keep the two apart. The hard facts are these. There really was a man named George C. Parker. He was born in New York City, by most accounts in March of 1860. His trade was selling real estate he did not own to people who did not know any better. The work of a swindler, plain and simple. He was arrested more than once. He was convicted more than once, and in the end he went to prison for the rest of his life. Those things are documented. They sit in court records and prison records and the newspapers of his day. But a great deal of the rest, the part that made him famous, comes down to us as folklore. The image of him selling the Brooklyn Bridge twice a week, every week, for 30 years straight, is almost certainly an exaggeration. Some of it traces back to Parker himself, a man who lied for a living, and who, by all accounts, loved to tell a tall tale. Historians who have looked closely tend to say he sold the bridge a handful of times, not hundreds. The eye-watering prices you sometimes read, $50,000 for the bridge in a single sale, are hard to verify and may belong more to the legend than to the ledger. So as we go, keep that line in mind. The man was real. The crime was real. The cartoon version, the one where he runs a daily bridge sale like a fruit stand, is a story people told because it was too good not to tell. What does seem genuinely true is how the con worked, because the method is the same one swindlers had used for a long time and would use long after him. Parker would find his mark, often a recent arrival, sometimes a tourist wide-eyed at the sights. He had help. By some accounts, he paid off the men who drove the ferries and the wagons that carried immigrants from the docks, so they would steer a likely target his way and whisper that here was a gentleman worth talking to. Then Parker went to work, and his first tool was not the bridge. His first tool was himself. He dressed well. He spoke with the easy confidence of a man who had nothing to prove. He did not chase the mark. That is the heart of every good confidence game, and Parker understood it in his bones. He let the mark come to him. He would mention, almost as a burden, that he owned a piece of property, something grand, something everyone knew. And then he would seem reluctant to part with it. He would say it was a headache to run, that the upkeep was killing him, that he only wished he could find an honest buyer with the means to take it off his hands. The more he pulled back, the more the mark leaned in. Greed did half the work for him. By the time Parker named a price, the buyer felt like he was the one getting the deal of a lifetime. And then there were the papers. This is where Parker rose above an ordinary street hustler. He produced documents, forged deeds, bills of sale, official-looking certificates with seals and signatures, the kind of thing a man fresh off a boat had no way to check and every reason to trust. In a country where he could not read the fine print, where he did not yet know which offices to call or which clerks to ask, a thick stack of impressive paper was its own kind of truth. Parker is said to have kept a whole supply of these forgeries ready to go. He even, the story runs, set up a fake office now and then, a borrowed room with a desk and a nameplate, so the transaction would feel solid and real. The mark signed. He paid. He walked out into the New York sunshine, the proud owner of a national landmark, and George Parker walked the other way with the cash. The price moved to fit the mark. By the accounts that come down to us, Parker would charge whatever he judged a buyer could bear, asking sums that ranged from as little as $50 or $75 on the low end to figures running into the thousands, and in the boldest of the tales as high as $50,000 in a single sale. One of the earliest sales that appears in the record, said to have happened around 1885, went to a visitor from Indiana who is supposed to have handed over $1,000 in cash with a promise of $4,000 more to be paid in installments, the way an honest man might buy a farm. Whether that exact deal is solid history or a story polished smooth by retelling is hard to say. Even the careful accounts note that the scam drew almost no newspaper coverage in those first years, which is part of why pinning down when it really began is so difficult. Some say he started in the 1880s. Some say the 1890s. Some put it later still. The fog sits right at the beginning of the story, and an honest teller has to leave it there rather than pretend to a certainty the evidence does not support. Now think about why it held together as long as it did. A man who has just been robbed this way is not eager to admit it. Picture his shame. He has crossed an ocean, he has told his family back home that he is making good, and now he has handed his savings to a stranger for a bridge. Who does he go to? The police. To confess that he believed he could buy the Brooklyn Bridge? Many of the victims, it seems, simply swallowed the loss and said nothing, too embarrassed to come forward. Their silence was Parker's shield. Every quiet, humiliated mark was one less complaint on a desk, one less reason for a detective to come looking. The con fed on the very pride that brought people to America in the first place. The bridge was the jewel of his trade, but Parker did not stop there, and the list of what he supposedly sold reads like a tour of New York's proudest places. He is said to have sold Grant's tomb, the great granite monument on Riverside Drive, where the Civil War general and former President Ulysses S. Grant is buried. For that one, the legend goes, Parker would pose as Grant's own grandson, a grieving heir who could not afford to keep the family memorial and needed a buyer to take on its care. Imagine the nerve of that, to stand before a national shrine and claim the blood of the man inside it, all to pick a stranger's pocket. He reportedly sold the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He reportedly sold the original Madison Square Garden. And in the boldest tale of all, he is said to have sold the Statue of Liberty herself, the copper woman, in the harbor lifting her torch over the very newcomers he was busy fleecing. There is a dark joke buried in that. The statue stood as a promise to the immigrant, a welcome, a symbol of the open door, and here was a man turning that symbol into bait, selling the welcome to the welcomed. How much of this specific list is solid history, and how much is the legend swelling with each retelling, we cannot fully untangle. The landmarks come up again and again in the accounts, but the details shift from one teller to the next, and that drift is itself a warning sign. What matters is the shape of the thing, and the shape is true to his trade. Parker dealt in the impossible sale. He understood that the more absurd the claim, the less likely an honest person was to imagine anyone would dare make it. Nobody questions a man bold enough to sell the Statue of Liberty, precisely because no sane person would try. His audacity was his armor. It is worth saying plainly that George Parker did not invent this game, and was not the only man playing it. Selling the Brooklyn Bridge became something of a New York tradition among confidence men, a set piece passed from one operator to the next. Other swindlers are recorded working the very same con on the very same bridge. One man, by some accounts named Edward Brasso, is said to have been selling the bridge to Italian newcomers around 1900, which means Parker was either sharing the territory or following a path others had already worn. There is even uncertainty about Parker's own name. A number of researchers point to evidence that the man behind the legend was really named John McCarthy, and that George C. Parker was itself only one of his many false identities, the one that happened to stick to the story. So when we say Parker sold the Brooklyn Bridge, we are using a name he may have stolen to describe a con he may have borrowed, in a tale that grew taller every time it was told. That does not make it untrue. It makes it human, and a little harder to hold, like most things that pass from fact into folklore. So why did it work, beyond the forged papers and the smooth talk? It worked because of the moment in time. This was an age before the safeguards we take for granted. There was no quick way to check a deed against a public record from across a counter. There was no telephone in every pocket to call a friend and ask if any of this made sense. A newcomer could not search a name and find a warning in seconds the way you can right now. Information moved slowly, and trust filled the gaps. A man in a good suit with official papers and a confident voice was, for many people, indistinguishable from an honest broker. The con worked because the tools to catch it did not yet exist, and the people most likely to be caught were the least equipped to protect themselves. It also worked because the law, for a long stretch, was not built to stop a man like Parker. He was not violent. He took no hostages and fired no shots. He committed fraud, forgery, the petty and not so petty crimes of the swindler. And in his day, those were often treated as something a man could do a short stretch for and walk back out into the world to do again. And that is exactly what Parker did. He was caught. He went to jail. He came out. He went back to work. For a confidence man, prison was a cost of doing business, not a wall. The records that survive show a man who slipped the law's grip more than once. By the accounts that come down to us, Parker operated under a whole wardrobe of false names. He went by William McCloundy. He went by James J. O'Brien, and was said to sign worthless checks with the initials I.O.U. before the name O'Brien, a private joke at his victim's expense. He passed himself off as Mr. Roberts and Mr. Taylor and others besides, the way another man might change his coat, so that a fresh complaint about one name might never connect to the long history of another. A new name was a new clean slate, at least until the police pieced the picture together. And the convictions did come, spread across the years like mile markers on a long downhill road. The record shows him caught for grand larceny around the turn of the century and sent up the river. It shows him caught for forgery and sent back. The same crimes surface again through the 1910s and into the 1920s. Theft and forgery and worthless checks. Conviction after conviction, each one a few years that should have ended his career and somehow never quite did. He would serve his time, walk back out into a city that had not stopped being full of hopeful strangers, and find his way back to the only work he was truly good at. A detective who knew him is supposed to have called him one of the smartest men he had ever met, and Parker himself, late in life, is said to have grumbled that it had been far easier to part fools from their money in the good old days. The country was learning, he was not. As for the bridge, the law finally found a blunt and simple answer to the toll booth problem. The story goes that the authorities, tired of explaining to one new owner after another that the public bridge was not theirs to tax, put up signs, plain signs, posted around the approaches, declaring the structure government property and not for sale. There is a quiet comedy in that, and a quiet sadness too. It had come to the point where the city had to hang a notice on its own most famous landmark to warn the gullible that no, this was not on the market, no matter what the smiling gentleman with the papers had told them. And then there is the escape, which is one of the best documented and most delicious moments in the whole tangled story. Parker, facing the law once again, is said to have gotten himself out of custody in 1908 by sheer bluff. The tale, which appears in the more careful accounts and not just the wild ones, is that he simply put on a sheriff's hat and a sheriff's coat and walked out the door as if he belonged there, as if he were one of the men guarding the place rather than one of the men being held in it. He used the same weapon on the jailers that he used on his marks. He dressed the part, he carried himself like a man with every right to do what he was doing, and people's eyes told them what they expected to see. He walked right past the law wearing the law's own clothes. But a man cannot keep walking out forever. Each arrest left a mark on the record, each conviction stacked on the last, and as the years wore on, the world that had let Parker thrive began, slowly, to close in on him. The thing that finally caught him was not a clever detective or a brave victim. It was a law. In the state of New York, in the 1920s, lawmakers passed a set of tough new statutes aimed at habitual criminals, a package that came to be known by the name of the state senator behind it, Caleb Baum's. The Baum's Law, as people called it, carried a hard edge. Under it, a person convicted of a felony for the fourth time could be sentenced to life in prison, no matter how small that fourth crime might seem on its own. The idea was to take the men who treated jail as a revolving door and shut the door for good. It was meant for exactly the kind of repeat offender that George Parker had spent a lifetime being. The trap closed on him in 1928. By then, Parker was an old man by the standards of his day, somewhere in his late 60s, still working the only trade he knew. The charge that brought him down was, by the accounts that survive, a worthless check, said to be in the amount of $150. Sit with that number for a second. A man whose legend has him selling the Brooklyn Bridge for $50,000 at a stretch was finally undone by a bad check for $150. There is the whole arc of a swindler's life in that gap. The grand claims at the start, and the shabby small crime at the end. On the 17th of December, 1928, in the Kings County Court in Brooklyn, the borough whose bridge had made him famous, George C. Parker, was sentenced to a mandatory term of life in prison. The fourth strike had landed. The man who had sold the Brooklyn Bridge would cross no more rivers. They sent him up the Hudson to Sing Sing, the grim fortress of a prison at Ossining, New York, a place whose very name had become a byword for hard time. And here the story does something unexpected. By the accounts that survive, Parker did not waste away in bitterness. He became, of all things, a kind of celebrity behind the walls. The guards knew who he was. The other inmates knew who he was. He was the man who sold the Brooklyn Bridge, and he leaned into the legend with the same relish he had once used to sell it. He told his stories. He entertained the cell blocks with tales of the marks he had fooled and the landmarks he had moved, the suckers who tried to set up toll booths, the buyers who had argued with policemen over a bridge they were certain they owned. Whether every tale was true hardly mattered anymore. He had become his own best advertisement, performing his greatest hits for a captive crowd that could not get away and did not want to. He spent the rest of his life there. The exact date of his death is one more place where the records and the retellings disagree, and an honest account should say so. Many popular sources place his death in 1936. The most detailed reference, drawing on records, gives the 9th of January, 1937. Either way, in the middle of the 1930s, with the country deep in the Great Depression and a new generation of swindlers already at work, George Parker died inside the walls of Sing Sing, a prisoner for life, far from the bridge that had carried his name into legend. And yet, in a strange way, the con outlived the con man, because the most lasting thing George Parker left behind was not a forged deed or a court file. It was a sentence. To this day, when an American wants to call someone hopelessly gullible, when someone has just swallowed a story far too good to be true, the answer comes ready-made. If you believe that, I have a bridge to sell you. People say it without thinking. They say it who have never heard the name George Parker, who do not know there was a real man, or a real bridge, or a real crowd of real immigrants who handed over real savings at the foot of those stone towers. The phrase has floated free of its history, but the history is there underneath it, and the bridge in the saying is, more likely than not, his bridge, the Brooklyn Bridge, sold over and over to people who only wanted to believe. Now and then, it is worth asking why the story stuck so hard, why we still pass it around more than a century later. Part of it is the sheer cheek of it. There is a guilty thrill in the image of a man brazen enough to sell a public bridge, and we tell it half as a warning and half as a grin. But there is something sharper under the grin, and it is worth sitting with. Every one of Parker's marks wanted the same thing. They wanted in. They wanted to own a piece of the country they had crossed an ocean to reach, to plant a flag, to turn their savings into a stake in the future. The bridge, the statue, the museum, the tomb, these were not just landmarks to them. They were the visible body of the American dream, and the chance to own one felt like the dream made solid. Parker did not invent their hunger. He only read it and fed it back to them with a forged deed attached. The con worked because the longing was real. That is the cruel genius of it. He sold people exactly what they came for, and the only thing wrong with it was that none of it was his to sell. That is the part that reaches all the way to you, sitting here now, long after the last forged deed crumbled to dust. The machinery has changed, and nothing else has. The mark today does not stand at the foot of a bridge. He sits in front of a glowing screen. The smooth stranger in the good suit is now a voice on the phone, a message from a number you do not know, a face in a video that was never real, a website built overnight to look like a bank you trust. The forged deed is now a forged login page. The fake office with the borrowed nameplate is now a fake company with a real-looking seal. And the pitch is the very same pitch Parker used at the river. Here is a chance most people never get. Here is a fortune for almost nothing. Act now, quietly, before the moment slips away, and tell no one until it is done. It still works for the same reason it worked then. Not because people are stupid. Parker's victims were not stupid. They were hopeful, and they were trusting, and they were reaching for something good, and a man stepped into the gap between their hope and their knowledge and took everything they had. The defense has never been to stop hoping. The defense is the small, unglamorous habit of stopping to check, of asking the plain question, of remembering that the deal which seems too good to be true is the oldest shape a lie can take. The bridge is never really for sale. It never was. George Parker understood people better than most honest men ever bother to. He understood that we believe what we want to believe, that a confident voice can paper over 1,000 doubts, that shame keeps the cheated quiet and lets the cheat move on to the next. He built a life out of that knowledge, and it carried him from the docks of New York to a cell at Sing Sing and into a phrase that millions of us still say without knowing whose ghost we are quoting. The next time those words come out of your mouth, if you believe that, I have a bridge to sell you, you might remember that there really was a bridge, and a man, and a long line of dreamers, who learned the hard way that the easiest thing in the world to sell is hope. If you want more forgotten stories like this one, the true ones, the history books leave out, you know what to do.